Welcome to the Software Lifecycle Stories podcast. We bring you stories of what worked and sometimes what did not in the course of discovering, designing, developing, delivering, and using software based solutions, as shared by practitioners who went through these situations. Diwakar Menon, known as Diwakar, has over 30 years of work experience ranging from test consulting to delivery to pre-sales. He has headed service delivery for key customer contracts that encompass a variety of services from software, quality assurance, testing, application development, application management, infrastructure management, and business support services across multiple pillars of telecom, banking and financial services, government, as well as health. He is also the co-founder of Last Mile Consultants, a boutique test consulting organization that works with IT service providers, product organizations, captives, and startups and helps set up or improve the software testing functions. Diwakar, in his career, has worked with CMC, which is now TCS, Tata Unisys, which is also now TCS, Deutsche Software, which is now HCL Technologies, Pero Systems, which is now Dell, and Tech Mahindra, which is still Tech Mahindra. Hi, Diwakar. Welcome to the show. Been a long time since we have connected, but I thought this is a good opportunity for us to catch up and also share your experiences in working with software over the last so many years. So for the benefit of our audience, would you like to introduce yourself?
Hi, Shiv. Thanks for having me. To be very frank, it's my first podcast, and it's always a new learning. It's a new medium. I have been listening to podcasts and following a few of them around, but being invited to speak for one, well, that's a first for me. So thanks. A little bit of a background. I started working in '88 in Bombay. I still call it Bombay. And my first job was with CMC with the railway reservation project. I was thrown into a support role there. And from there, I moved on to, I worked on, and that was an online transaction processing system. So at that time, I said, okay, that's great. Now let's work on something which is real time. And I worked on a power plant control system. And then for about, and then I think Bangalore was then the upcoming place. Moved to Bangalore and joined Tata Unisys. And that's when we met, if I remember right. That was way back in '93. And from then on, it's been a journey that was in the quality management field. And from there, it's been heading quality functions. From a quality management, I moved into what I thought was then quality control, which was testing. And that was somewhere around '98. And testing wasn't known or wasn't sexy at that point in time. And I have been in testing and then grown from there into application support, came back to testing, went back into account management, came back to testing. And then I think that's where I stayed. And over the last 6 years, I stepped out from corporate life and started our own firm, which is largely focused around testing and test consulting. And we've had a variety of clients as a part of that, both large organizations, IT services organizations, product organizations, startups. And very honestly, it's been a learning in every one of those engagements, because you don't have the ego of how would you say that I am the boss and I will tell you what to do, as opposed to trying to understand a person's problem and figuring out what is the best solution there. And that, I think, is an approach that changed me over the last 7 years now that we started Last Mile. So that's the journey that a little bit of me, Shiv.
Wonderful. Actually, you are also the first guest on my show now who is seeing the ultimate output from software development when you said testing. And interestingly, everywhere else in all other industries, the testing function, like you mentioned, is called the quality control function. Whereas in software, most of the time we call it as QA, the quality assurance part. Now, over the years, when you've been looking at software, once it is created, by the time it's probably, most of the decisions have been taken, a lot of implementations have been done. What has been your experience in terms of the quality going into what is being developed?
That has Shiv evolved over the years, right? I mean, there was always this misnomer, or at least there was this classical definition of what one called quality assurance, which is putting the right processes in to build products versus quality control to validate the outputs of those processes, right? And testing was considered QC because you're testing an output of a developer's job, so to speak, right? It kind of testers were never involved in the early stages. You were given a set of requirements. You were told to create tests or test plans at that point in time, and you had no say in whether those requirements were good, bad, ugly. You just tested it, raised defects, and logged them. And invariably, you would find that there's a huge level of mismatch between what was stated as a part of the requirements and what was delivered as a part of the developer's outcome, right? So that was a kind of initial view that a lot of people had, and I think over a period of time, I have seen that whole function evolve, and I think Agile has contributed to that, DevOps has contributed to that in a long way, where people are more interested in getting a view of whether the requirement itself is right or not. And that, I think, has been a good set of inputs that testers are actually contributing into the life cycle, or having a say in what the requirements are. That's one portion of it. So having a say in that is what I would call the driving the requirements in the right way. The second aspect that I think has evolved in my mind is the fact that in recent years it's about going to market faster, right? I need the product out. I need to gain market share. Otherwise, I'll get eaten up by my competitors, etc., etc. So now that has prompted the whole fact of let's get the product out faster. If so, what is the minimum that we need to develop, and what is the minimum that we need to test so that things don't break, right? And so now you're not talking about quality control, you're talking more of risk and saying, hey, what would happen should my product break, and should I do to mitigate that risk? And I think I'm seeing the function evolve to more of a risk management function, and there are different stakeholders in all this. So testers now need to talk about risk, not only from whether it's meeting the requirements, but whether it is mitigating the risk of some stakeholder who is possibly a user or even an operational staff, and validating whether those risks still exist or don't exist. So I think that's the shift, which is a good shift in my mind, because now, I mean, let's face it, the reality of shipping products out faster is not going to change. So it's a good shift that people are now thinking about how to mitigate risk, get the product out, great, not a problem. And you then become a partner in development, as opposed to somebody who's been given a product, thrown over the wall, so to speak, and told, test it and tell me if there are any problems or not. And yeah, I'll decide whether, what you're telling me is worth taking into account or not. So that's the evolution, which is good that one is seeing in the marketplace now.
That's interesting. So that triggered one question. See, in the manufacturing industry, when some of these processes evolved, there is also this concept of what they call pokayoke, or mistake proofing, where while you have a process, the thought is that enforcement of the process is essentially an overhead. But if you can prevent mistakes from happening. Now, coming from the testing and acting on behalf of, let's say, the users or the architects or the product owners, what do you think is a way by which the testers can develop greater empathy in terms of the production environment? Of course, in DevOps, some of them may be coming up. But as a tester, if I were to become a great tester, what quality should I be developing?
It's interesting. It's a very interesting field, and there is a whole lot of thought. If you look at it, there are different schools of thought on testing. One which is the traditional process-oriented thought. The other, which is what one would call the context-driven school of testing thought, which is oriented towards understanding the context of the product or its usage. So how do you approach the problem as such, right? And I think testers, if you want to be a good tester, you should be able to figure out what is it that you're testing in the first place, right? I mean, it could be different things that you want to test at different points in time. You could be testing as a user. That means, so as a user, when I use the product, what is the experience that I have, right? It's a lot about usability aspects. If I was a user who had disabilities, then and I put myself in those shoes, then what should or how should the software behave? So you're talking a little bit about accessibility. So your focus now is accessibility. If I was a user who's extremely impatient and I want a fast response time, then I'm talking about how does the application respond from a performance perspective. If I was an operations user, I was somebody who's supposed to maintain the system, then does the application throw out the right error messages so that I can, very quickly understand what the issue is and then be able to test. So now you're talking about testers having to wear different hats, take on personas that they may be comfortable or may not be comfortable with, but you're talking about that kind of skill that testers need to acquire given the context of how the application is being used. And then very quickly understand that which one is most important. So I could test a whole lot of scenarios, but I have, I know that within 2 weeks, the product is getting out, right? It's a 2-week cycle and the product is going out. So which one, what is my first test case, right? It's a question that I always ask testers. Yes, I've got 100 things that you need to test. Which is the first test that you will execute? Which is the next test? Which is the third? Which are the ones, if I compress that 3 days into 2, will you discard because you don't have the time? I mean, let's be practical about that. So it all comes down to how testers can also then very quickly evaluate, which is the one that is most important given a certain persona that they have, given the objective of that application, and who are the stakeholders, and what is the maximum damage that it can cause which stakeholder. And being able to understand that, I think, is a skill that is most important. So if you want to be a good tester, I think you should learn to put yourself into different shoes, different personas, and you should be able to very quickly narrow down which are the aspects of tests that you can very quickly understand. Then if you have programming skills, you know that these tests will get repeated, you have the ability to automate. So automation is, in my terms, more a byproduct and should be a byproduct of your testing, so that it's more like an insurance coverage. It's not something that you would focus on first in my mind. People always think about automation saving lots of time. It does save time, but it's more like an insurance coverage in my mind. So automation skills will also possibly help out there.
Yeah, what about some of the soft skills? Because invariably, uh, there is a stereotypical thing that the devs and the QA are always at loggerheads. Or if you find something, you need to be able to convey that so that the devs can either reproduce or actually fix it. And one thing which I have noticed among many testers is that they actually have a very high sense of ownership. They test and then they say they are so upset when something is not working, or possibly also because some of them have to finally certify that the code is ready to be moved to the next stage.
So yes, you're right. Testers who are really passionate about their job are the ones who will say that, who the people who will put their foot down and say this product is not fit to go out, right, into production, just not worth it. Now, the softer aspects come into play, and I think it's true with a lot of jobs. But uh, for testers to be very clear about what the problems really are, a good tester will know how to articulate what is wrong with the product and what might be the risks that the product will face when used by whichever different types of users, right? Once it's out in production. So if a good tester can articulate that well, I don't think there is any stakeholder or any developer who is in a position to ignore that. Now you can make a business decision as to whether you want to release it or not. That is definitely a stakeholder's prerogative. But the fact remains that a tester, if he articulates that well, is listened to and heard. And good testers are always respected in any product team. So people who don't treat developers as enemies. In fact, good testers use developers in the way the olden time CIAs used to use agents across, in foreign countries. They would glean information from them and find out what are the ways that developers are trying to take shortcuts and whether those shortcuts are worth it, etc. So a good tester can possibly sometimes devise stress strategies depending upon how developers have developed. And those are things that, so being a friend with a developer always helps. Being, uh, you know, being, being told by a developer what to test is possibly not the right thing to do. So you need to be clear about what you want to test. And sometimes testers do fall into traps which the developer says, I've only changed this portion, so test here only. And forget the fact that, their job is really to come to an independent decision about what may have possibly been regressed, etc. So I think maintaining that good communication about if it's in defects, how to write a good, articulate a defect correctly, how to articulate the risk of that defect correctly, how to articulate the result of one's testing, how to glean information from different stakeholders. So that questioning and probing attitude that testers should typically have when they look at a requirement and say, yeah, what you've written is good, but here are the gaps. Can you tell me what would happen if this kind of a user used it? And somebody would say, yeah, but that's a default user. And people then tend to unfortunately, unlike manufacturing, the specifications in software is still very vague. And the clearer it is, and the more questions that can be asked of it, and thus improve the clarity, the better it can be developed, the better it can be tested.
So obviously your passion comes through. Now, what was the bug that turned you an entrepreneur?
I think what was the bug that made me an entrepreneur? I think, it's...
Well, the pun was kind of intended.
Correct. It's I think for a long time, I always wondered what it would be like to run a business and whether I had it in me. I had seen a delivery side of things. I had seen the pre-sales side of things where one worked very closely with the salespeople in terms of trying to close a deal. Uh, so it was always very exciting. It was a good thought that, oh, I should try and do some things on my own. Now the question was what, and I did try this about back in 2005. I set out to be a consultant and started, trying to see whether I could create a consulting offering. But then I think I failed there. I did that for about 6-8 months, and I think I failed there because I didn't have the right view of what a consulting organization should look like or be like. And at back then in 2005, I always thought that to a lot of people, consulting was about, okay, so can you come in and what's the rate at which you will come in, right? And it always became a very rate oriented deal. Secondly, I also discovered that you needed to have selling yourself or selling services that you might have was always a difficult proposition. I don't think I had it in me to be a salesman then. And that I discovered is the biggest gap that you have. So I went back into a job, worked for some more time, and then I think the bug, as you say, bit again. And I said, let me give it a whirl. And this time we were very clear. There were two other people who co-founded this with me, and we worked well as a team. We had a good we had a good thought process in terms of what we wanted to do, and we were very clear that it would be testing, and it would be around test consulting, and we did a lot, and we defined the services that we would offer. So I think that way it turned out to be a little more, the start was much more better and much little more clear about what it was back before in 2005. So I think that somewhere there, it was always there, and if it itches, scratch it. I think that happened at the right possible time.
Yeah, it's always very interesting to talk to entrepreneurs and people who made the shift. But in the line that you have chosen, that is testing, and you also referred to being friendly with the developers and the need for a lot of close interactions. Now, coming in as an outsider, what are the typical challenges, or how do you overcome some of these barriers that probably hold a tester back?
So I think a lot of what we did was, helping transform test teams, right? So it was looking at how test teams worked and whether they were optimally engaged, if you will, right? So as a service, we went in, we would assess how mature was their testing, what they needed to do, how it fit in within the overall development life cycle, etc. And when we did that, we worked not only with the test team, we worked with the development team, or we understood the development challenges, we understood the stakeholder, the product owner challenges, we understood operational challenges if there were operations involved. And we brought that table. Unfortunately, what happens in a lot of organizations is they tend to get very siloed in their thoughts. And sometimes organizational dynamics, tend to create a kind of inertia, if you will, right? That people are not able to move forward. And it always makes sense when somebody coming in from the outside helps them and helps draw that roadmap and improves the interaction and works with the team in terms of saying, okay, now this is how, let's get involved in your Scrum meetings, for example. Let's see, what the dynamics there are. And then be able to suggest what might or might not happen. And I think the moment people decide to bring us in, there is that acceptability of change, at least, that comes in. And I think that is important. If you're just thrown into a situation where people don't want you and are not ready to listen to you, then it doesn't matter, how good your advice is, it just won't work. But when people are hiring you and they say that, yes, we know something is broken, we really are struggling to fix it ourselves, can you help us out there? I think that makes a bigger difference. And some of our successes have come from people who have better been able to understand that, and then better been able to take on the uh, advice or methodologies that we have suggested.
The outside in perspective is actually very interesting. I think that is a great value that any testing team or a tester can add. Do you have any stories where you found things that probably were obvious to you, or something that kind of surprised the dev team, saying, "Oh, why didn't we think of that?"
Interestingly, in a lot of cases, a good example is a startup that we're working with, right? And there are people who are constantly in this state of, let's get the next version of the product out. And whilst they think that they're going fast, and because they're solving challenges every time, etc. I think the first meeting that I attended when they did a retrospective, okay, well, let me take a step back. Before that, we were talking to the product owners, we were talking to the developers, and everybody painted a nice rosy picture of how things were going. Product owner said, "Yeah, I'm able to articulate requirements. I'm able to state things." They stated the obvious minimal challenges that they face. The developers said, "Yeah, we work. We have daily Scrum calls. We discuss issues. Everything's fine." The tester said, "Yeah, when the product owner gives us the requirement, we create test cases. Everything sounded fine." Then we attended the retrospective, and the first thing that stood out to us was, they had taken on, let's say, 20 stories, and they had completed only 11. And I paused the meeting there, and I said, "Can you tell me why only 11?" And then we heard things that were very, very different from what they had stated in these one-on-one meetings, right? All their internal challenges about how the story is not properly articulated, how I did develop it, but how it was not adequately tested, how the testers did not figure out that they had to test for persona X and persona Y, started tumbling out of that cupboard. And I think in that 2 hours after that, we took a step back and just summarized everything, and people looked at it and said, "Oh, this is interesting." And I think that was a good aha moment for everybody concerned, not just for us, but I think that was good for everybody concerned, because it gave people such a very different perspective about the way they were doing things, or not accepting some of the issues that actually bubbled out. So that all you needed to do was pause the conversation at times and ask people to take a step back, and it's good. One of the things that we possibly my auditing background, which I learned under my mentor JV, was that zoom in on issues, right? And when you're trying to audit an engagement, you're trying to very quickly figure out on a sample which might be the right sample to pick. And I think that kind of also helped. So there were lots of these aha moments that came in different phases. This was one. I think people realized we were doing another engagement for a large client where they were doing a capability assessment. I mean, they thought they were all equipped, and we did they had the right people. People were, in India, in the IT services companies, as you're aware, a lot of people, their assessment is more by the people who do their assessment rather than by the base skills that get really evaluated, unfortunately. So when you baseline somebody's skills at some point in time, you get a true picture of what the capabilities are. And in one of the instances, we realized that there were people who were much more experienced, higher cost to the company, whose capabilities did not extend to what they needed for that level or for that role, right? And I think that was also another aha moment for the organization. So I think the trying to figure out what the true problem is. I think sometimes we have failed in that. I'll be very honest, because sometimes it's the organization dynamics are cloud the ability to figure out what might be the real problem. But sometimes and most times, hopefully, when we get it, it works wonders. So those aha moments are worth every bit of the time that you spend as an entrepreneur, I would say.
Wow, that gives a different perspective in terms of, let's say, the productivity of a tester. When you talked about senior or more expensive people versus probably what the task requires. Now, for somebody who has been in testing for a while, what are some ways in which the value contribution of the individual can increase? Obviously, the costs will be going up year on year. And with automation and other tools, new technologies coming in, is there a decrease in the need for independent testing? And what is the value that an individual with a lot of experience can bring more than, say, somebody who's just starting out?
So I think two things, right? One of the things that I have always discovered is this, that at the end of the day, if you're trying to functionally test something, and a lot of the testers I see are functional testers, right? That knowledge of that domain is important. And if you don't invest sufficiently in yourself as you progress to understand that domain, down the line, the value that you might be able to contribute to will keep diminishing. So the good testers and the good managers or test managers or leads, or what I would call test architects, I think the test manager breed is kind of possibly, in my mind, dying. But test leads or test architects are people who are able to bring more value to with their right levels of domain skills. So that's one aspect I think people tend to forget quite a bit. And I don't mean just knowing your product, but knowing how competitor products work, how other organizations in that domain also function, what do they do. So that knowledge is always important there. The second aspect of testing is always, yes, the ability to use tools to do repetitive tasks, and the understanding that these tasks can get repetitive very quickly. How do I figure out how to automate that, right? And by automation, I don't mean that you need to know Selenium, you need to know a programming language. You could automate some things using simple batch programs. You could automate things using Excel, for example, comparison of data and things like that, right? But automate reasonably repetitive tasks so that you don't bring do the same things over and over again. Third, I think there's a lot of interesting things happening in the world nowadays in terms of either technology, because technology lends its own challenges, right? The move to cloud, and most companies are talking about that. So when you move to cloud, your testing focus is a little more different now as opposed to a standalone application. When you're, so think about what you might be able to do out there. You could even move across in testing. And that's one thing that I like about testing, is that you can specialize in so many different aspects. You can specialize as a domain tester, as a functional tester. You could specialize in terms of skills with tools. You could specialize in terms of specific types of testing like security or performance, or even accessibility or usability. Those are all very nice niche specialized fields. And once you dive into them, it's a whole realm of of knowledge that you can gain, or a different understanding. So you could go horizontal. You could look at tools that are coming up. You could look at things like AI, and now AI is being talked about a lot, how it can be leveraged in testing. You don't need complicated algorithms. You don't need to know complicated tools. You can use tools like NIME, for example, which I'm experimenting with, where you can drag and drop different actions. And these are things that you can look at the data that is available, whether that data is sufficient, whether that's throwing out different insights. So you can evolve yourself as you go further, and it need not necessarily be that you stay with the same, old mindset. You could specialize in risk management. You could, go there and be a new risk assessor, so to speak, of releases and products. I mean, there is a whole lot of dimensions that are there that within the testing field you could, specialize in. Sometimes, the traditional services mindset of span of control, you probably may have to ditch that if you really want to be, if you're passionate about testing.
So I see two different kind of streams or cross currents or lines of thought. One that says, you wrote it, you fix it. We don't need a separate tester. The concept like the SDET and stuff like that. And the other would be the independent verification and validation teams. Now, how do you see these trends kind of converging or diverging, or ultimately finding a balance?
It's an interesting field, okay, and it's an interesting thought. And I have seen some experiments on this. One team does all, with no clear distinction of test teams, etc. Right? And to be very honest, that's work. But they were a very high functioning development organization. We went in there, we heard what they were doing, we looked at what they were doing, and there was a team of 4 or 5 developers, and they took a user story, they developed it, they made sure it wasn't breaking anything, they launched it out into the real world. If it failed, they were there at 3:00 in the morning to fix it, right? And that team was so well contained, so to speak, and a high functioning development organization that they just didn't need a test team. I saw that in another product that we evaluated for in another process area. And this was a product which had this was an organization that had 3 products. And in one of the products, they had this high functioning team. In the other 2, they had independent test teams. And the concept of if independent test teams, if you throw it over the wall and expect them to come back, that is the worst kind of organization that you can have. If you value inputs and value the kind of insights that you think a third individual, an independent individual can bring you, then you're integrating that individual as a part of your team. It could be, from a particular aspect of the product. It could be from, like I said, it could be around usability or accessibility or even certain domain functions and testing that. Or it could be about improving the speed at which they could possibly test it. If you respect that, then I think the teams could be well integrated. In my mind, it's given the vagueness with which requirements are defined, given the and all said and done, people call it they call it engineering, but very honestly, engineering is a more precise science, whereas we're still evolving, we're still in an art form, so to speak. So you need people who can give you independent opinions, who can give you who can think differently from what your developers are used to. So while developers think that they're engineering it, there needs to be somebody to validate whether the art that they have engineered, so to speak, still works in different aspects. I think there will be smaller, very fixed teams. I'm okay with that, and I think it's good. But I don't think development or the whole process has now reached a proportion where it can be well engineered. I think we're still a fair way away from that. And everything that I'm seeing in new trends about, artificial intelligence and usage of the new technologies, they all tend to be things that people are going to be plugging in with little or no understanding of what that impact might be. And somebody looking at it independently can always provide that. So I still see testing as an independent function, and I think it should be looked at from that way. it gives you a good perspective of risk. It gives you a good perspective from, before you make a release. And that I think is important.
Wow. I think almost every sentence you said is triggering multiple questions in my mind. But we'll probably do that in a separate session. But for today's session, for closing, I have one question which is related to outcomes. Now, whatever we spoke about so far is about testing the output that is being created. But increasingly, I find that the businesses or whoever is investing in developing software wants outcomes. Is there a role that the testing team or the quality team can play in ensuring or at least helping right from the problem identification, specification to the actual implementation of code to increase the chances or reduce the risk, as you were saying in the beginning of this conversation, of achieving the intended outcomes?
So there is, okay. In my mind, Shiv, let's look at the testing function as such, right? And I will keep that as a function. Now you can evolve that function to being a partner to the business, etc. But if I look at the testing function, there is somebody who is what I would call the business owner, who articulates where the business should be headed. And like any other function, the testing function should absorb that, should be able to understand that. Now, I'll give you an example of an engagement that we had created a team for, which was, let's say, the team want, the articulation there was that we want to be in the top 5 from a customer experience perspective. Now, that was it, right? That was, we are at number X, which was far beyond the 5. And we want to make sure that from a customer's perception perspective, we are at number 5. Now, any requirement that the organization picked had to be looked at from a point of view of saying, how does that fit in within the top 5, right? Does it make any meaningful step towards that point, top 5? Does it, can it be validated saying, if I do this, it is going to lead to some level of improvement? Can that improvement be measured, etc., right? So there was this need within the testing team also to figure out, okay, now what does that mean from a customer experience perspective? And then look at every single touch point that the customer had, and then try and figure out, okay, if this touch point fails, what does it mean in terms of, the top 5? And every single requirement or touch point was looked at it from that perspective. And I think that was an important insight that the teams could give by saying, if this fails, and this is the possibility why it might fail, right up front, right? So you were trying to decide the customer journey. You were trying to articulate the touch points. You were trying to validate those touch points. So while the journey was being written itself, right? And that is where the testing team contributed a lot towards validating that. I think it would be, in my mind, a more evolved test team can tell you whether top 5 is a testable feature at all or not, right? I mean, that's something, but I don't think I want to look at the testing function from that perspective. I think the partnership really starts once a direction is given, and they can tell you whether that direction can be maintained, is achievable in one place. And as and when you're taking on different product requirements, are you still on that path to the direction that you have evolved? I think that is a very feasible option, and I've seen good test teams do that very effectively. So given an organizational roadmap, how well are requirements aligned to that roadmap? And I think that's where, in my belief, the testing team will add a lot of value.
Oh, very nicely articulated. So thanks a lot, Diwakar, for taking the time. And as I said, there are more questions. We'll probably have a follow-up conversation. Also, I'm sure that our listeners also might have questions. When we get some questions, we'll pass them on to you.
Sure, Shiv. Thanks a lot. Really appreciate you having me on this podcast.
If you like the show and would like to share your experiences with the community or know someone else who might want to do that, please get in touch with us at podcast@pm-powerconsulting.com. That is podcast@pm-powerconsulting.com.